Nietzsche's forbidden insight: why society admires evil leaders. Have you ever wondered why some of the most ruthless, morally questionable, and even outright evil leaders in history are not just remembered, but admired? Why do people sometimes gravitate toward figures who embody domination, cruelty, and power devoid of compassion? Why do we, as a society, elevate those who seem to lack empathy, yet possess an iron will that bends the world around them? At first glance, it seems like a moral glitch in the human psyche, a tragic flaw. But Friedrich Nietzsche saw something deeper, something dangerous, something forbidden. He didn't just ask, why do evil leaders rise? He asked, why do we want them to? And in that question lies an insight so raw, so unsettling, that most people would rather ignore it than confront what it says about us. Let's start with the hook, not the historical villains, but you, me, us. What if I told you that within each of us is a hidden desire not to be good, but to be powerful? That beneath the surface of our morality, beneath the social norms and polite behavior, there is a primal voice that whispers, what if you didn't care? What if you took what you wanted? What if you ruled instead of obeyed? We bury that voice under layers of civility, but Nietzsche said it never dies. It waits, and when someone comes along, a charismatic leader, a bold disruptor, a brutal conqueror who acts out that forbidden impulse that we ourselves suppress, a part of us doesn't recoil, a part of us thrills.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more profound insights.
This is Nietzsche's forbidden insight. That good and evil are not opposites, they are perspectives. Not fixed categories, but masks we use to justify power plays. He believed morality itself was a human invention, designed not to liberate us but to chain us, to keep the strong from dominating the weak. He called this slave morality, a system built by the powerless to protect themselves from the will of the strong. And in contrast, he imagined the master morality, the worldview of those who create values, not inherit them. The ones who don't ask for permission, the ones who write their own rules. Sound familiar? It should. Because many of the leaders we call evil, many of the ones history condemns in textbooks, were masters of this very game. But here's where it gets uncomfortable. Nietzsche didn't say we should become dictators or tyrants. He said we should understand why we're drawn to them, why we secretly admire their audacity, why we envy their certainty, why in a world full of moral ambiguity, someone who acts with absolute conviction, even in darkness, can look like a kind of truth. We live in an age that celebrates empathy, diversity, and equality, and yet, when someone unapologetically asserts their will without compromise, they often become icons. Why? Because we are exhausted by our own inner contradictions. We are torn between what we want and what we've been taught to want, between our instincts and our ethics, our biology and our beliefs. And when someone rises who seems free of that tension, who doesn't apologize, who doesn't hesitate, who takes it, triggers something ancient in us. Not our higher selves, but our deeper selves. The part that wants to win, to dominate, to exist without shame. Now pause. Ask yourself, have you ever admired someone, even for a moment, not because they were good, but because they were powerful? Have you ever looked at someone who broke the rules and thought, I wish I could do that? That moment right there is what Nietzsche wanted us to see. Not to shame us, but to wake us up, to realize that our moral instincts are not pure. They are conflicted. And unless we confront that conflict, we become vulnerable to those who embody it without remorse. This is why society sometimes admires evil leaders. Not because we don't know they're evil, but because they represent something we feel we've lost. Clarity, will, freedom from guilt. Nietzsche believed that the modern world, in its pursuit of comfort and safety, had made us spiritually weak, that we had forgotten how to create values from within, that we outsourced our moral compass to institutions, religions, ideologies, and in doing so, we lost the courage to live authentically no matter the cost. So when someone comes along who does just that, even in a twisted way, they awaken a terrifying awe. We don't admire their cruelty, we admire their clarity, their refusal to compromise, their raw expression of will. And unless we learn to channel that same power within ourselves, consciously and ethically, we will always be at risk, not just of following the wrong leaders, but of becoming hollow ourselves. Here's the deeper question. What would your life look like if you reclaimed your own will to power? If you stopped outsourcing your values and started creating them? If you stopped fearing your darker instincts and started transforming them into strength? Nietzsche didn't want us to become tyrants. He wanted us to become sovereign, to become the kind of person who doesn't need evil leaders because we've integrated our own shadow. The seduction of strength, why power feels more honest than morality. Let's go even deeper. If Nietzsche was right, and that's a dangerous if, then morality, as we know it, is less about truth and more about utility. It is not the shining light of the soul, but a social technology, a strategy, something designed not to elevate us, but to domesticate us. And if that's the case, then we have to ask the unthinkable. What if strength, raw and unfiltered, feels more honest than morality because it is? What if power, especially when it isn't dressed in virtue, reveals something more fundamental about the human condition than all the ethical codes we built to contain it? You felt it. That moment when someone speaks with absolute authority, unburdened by doubt, and it cuts through the noise like a blade. That moment when someone acts decisively in a world that dithers in endless deliberation. The moment you see someone break a rule, not because they didn't know it, but because they didn't care. And something in you doesn't flinch. Something leans in. That's not your dark side awakening. That's your ancient self recognizing a signal it was built to respond to. Before we had laws, we had strength. Before we had ethics, we had survival. And somewhere deep in the architecture of our minds, that code still runs. Nietzsche warned us that we've created a world that praises goodness, but secretly rewards dominance. We teach children to be kind, but we admire the winners. We say play fair, but we worship those who succeed, even when they cheat. And this, he said, is not hypocrisy, it's pathology. A sign that our morality is not aligned with our instincts. A sign that we are pretending to be more virtuous than we truly are. And the more this gap widens, the more power becomes seductive because it feels like a return to something real. This is what Nietzsche meant by the will to power. Not just the desire to control others, but the deeper drive to assert oneself in the face of chaos. To shape reality rather than be shaped by it. To impose meaning where there is none. And morality, especially when it becomes rigid or self-righteous, can feel like a cage. It can feel like someone else's story that you're forced to live in. But power, even when it's brutal, even when it's wrong, feels like authorship. It feels like truth without apology. Now, here's the trap. When you're lost, when you're unsure, when life feels like a fog of contradictions, you don't crave kindness, you crave clarity. You don't want someone who empathizes, you want someone who knows. That's why evil leaders rise. Not because they're good at hiding their darkness, but because they're good at making it look like light. They don't lie about their intentions. They embody them. And in a world drowning in moral posturing, that authenticity, even if it's dark, feels like a breath of fresh air. But here's the paradox. That same clarity that seduces us can destroy us. Because power without morality is just force. It doesn't build, it consumes. It doesn't elevate, it dominates. Nietzsche wasn't blind to this. He knew the will to power could become monstrous. That's why he didn't preach it as a political doctrine or a leadership style. He offered it as a challenge to each of us, to confront our own hunger for power, to examine why we feel drawn to strength that doesn't apologize, and to ask whether we can embody that same strength with morality, not without it. I think about this. What if the people we admire most aren't the ones who are good in the traditional sense, but the ones who are whole, the ones who've made peace with their shadow, who've looked at their capacity for destruction and chosen creation instead, the ones who don't pretend to be saints but who choose, again and again, to be sovereign individuals in a world that begs for conformity. So ask yourself, when you admire someone's strength, are you really admiring their virtue or their will? When you follow a leader, are you following their goodness or their certainty? And most of all, can you become someone who doesn't need to choose between power and morality because you've learned to fuse them? Shadow Kings, the hidden psychology behind our love for tyrants. Let's now journey into the psychological underworld, the place where Nietzsche's insight becomes not just provocative, but personal. Because the truth is, tyrants don't rise in a vacuum. They rise from the collective psyche. They are not just individuals with ambition and ruthlessness, they are vessels, projections, archetypes. They become what Carl Jung might call our shadow kings, embodiments of everything we repress, secretly admire, and quietly wish we could be. When we admire tyrants, we are not simply celebrating their strength, we are unconsciously surrendering to our disowned selves. And this is where Nietzsche and depth psychology collide in a terrifying harmony. We all carry a shadow. It's the part of us we deny, suppress, or disown: our aggression, our selfishness, our lust for control, our hunger for superiority. And the more we deny it, the more it grows in the dark, the more we project it outward. So when a figure emerges who embodies that shadow, who says the things we're afraid to say, who does the things we won't allow ourselves to do, we don't just watch them. We worship them, because they act out the parts of us we buried. They become our mirror, distorted but revealing. This is why tyrants often rise in times of moral confusion or cultural collapse. When society loses its narrative, when institutions feel hollow, when people feel powerless or divided, the shadow becomes more seductive. And power, especially corrupt power, begins to feel like salvation. Tyrants offer something morality rarely does: simplicity. They reduce the complexity of life into binaries as V's. Them, strong V's, weak, winners V's, losers. And in that reduction they provide relief from doubt, from ambiguity, from the exhausting responsibility of thinking for ourselves. But here's the deeper danger. When we project our shadow onto a leader, we give them our power. We unconsciously say, "You do what I cannot. You embody what I'm afraid to be." And in doing so, we stop growing. We stop integrating. We become spiritually passive. Nietzsche's nightmare was not just the rise of the tyrant, it was the death of the individual. The disappearance of the self into collective obedience, into mass worship of power without self-awareness. And yet, the insight remains forbidden because it implicates us. It says, the tyrant exists because you invited him, because you made space for him in your psyche, because you were too afraid to claim your own sovereignty, so you gave it away to someone who promised they'd carry it for you. That's why Nietzsche's philosophy is not just a warning, it's a mirror. It asks us to confront the tyrant within before we condemn the tyrant without. So what happens when we do that? When we stop projecting and start integrating, we begin to reclaim the parts of ourselves that are powerful, assertive, unapologetic, but we do so consciously. We become capable of strength without cruelty, leadership without domination, will without destruction. We become, in Nietzsche's own vision, the Übermensch, not a superhuman in the comic book sense, but a self-overcoming individual, someone who has faced their shadow and emerged free. Here's your question: what part of yourself have you given away to someone else, simply because you were afraid to own it? What would it mean to stop admiring strength from a distance and instead begin embodying it with integrity? Tyrants don't scare Nietzsche, but unintegrated people, they terrified him. Because they're the ones who create the conditions for darkness to rise. The sovereign self: how to defeat tyranny without losing your soul. So how do we face this darkness without letting it consume us? How do we confront the tyrant within and still remain human? The final step in Nietzsche's forbidden insight is not about rejecting power, it's about claiming it differently. Not through domination or deceit, but through sovereignty. The sovereign self is not someone who avoids power, nor someone who blindly wields it. They are someone who integrates it. Someone who has looked at their capacity for destruction and chosen deliberately to create instead. This is the antidote to tyranny: not more rules, more systems, or more leaders, but more individuals who are whole. We defeat tyranny not by outsourcing our moral compass to someone who knows best, but by cultivating the wisdom to guide ourselves. That means doing the uncomfortable work of confronting your desires, not just the noble ones, but the selfish ones too. It means facing your envy, your anger, your urge to control, and not denying them, but transforming them. Nietzsche believed that the greatest kind of power wasn't over others, it was mastery over the self. The ability to say yes to life, yes to all of it, including the chaos, the pain, the rage, and to make something meaningful from it. The sovereign self doesn't need tyrants. They don't worship strength from afar because they've found it within. They don't follow blindly because they've learned to see clearly. And they don't fear the shadow because they've walked through it and come out with light. That kind of person becomes impossible to manipulate, because they are no longer seeking a parent in every politician, a savior in every speaker, or a god in every authority figure. They've stopped kneeling, not out of arrogance, but out of awakening. And that's what Nietzsche ultimately wanted: not a race of superhumans who dominate the weak, but a culture of individuals who take radical responsibility for their own becoming, who don't hide behind morality like a shield or worship power like a drug, but who live consciously, courageously, and creatively. People who don't just ask what is good or evil, but who ask, what am I becoming? And is it mine? So now the final question lands on you like a weight and a gift. Are you willing to stop admiring power and start embodying it? Are you ready to face the shadow you project onto the world and pull it back into your chest where it belongs? Because the tyrant only rises when the people forget who they are. But the sovereign self, they don't forget. They remember. They remember that freedom is not given, it's claimed, and that the only real revolution begins within. This is Nietzsche's forbidden insight, not a glorification of evil, but an invitation to greatness, to become whole, to stop worshipping false gods of control and fear, and instead become the author of your own soul. The question is, will you dare?